Welcome and good evening. My name is Samir Gandesha, and I'm the director of the Institute for the Humanities. It gives me tremendous pleasure to invite you here this evening to our discussion of our film this evening, Eagoraoque. Is that correct? Is that how you pronounce it?
Eagoraoque.
Eagoraoque.
Yeah. Now what?
All right. Great. Before I go on to introduce the panelists for this evening, I'd just like to first acknowledge that this event is taking place on the unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples, the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. I'd also like to just acknowledge as well the fact that we've got a fairly important change of identity that is imminent. Identity, of course, figures very greatly in the film, and I think also probably in the discussion this evening. But at the Institute, we will be changing our identity. Well, I mean, our identity will pretty much stay as it is, but our name is going to change. And the name will change from the Institute for the Humanities to the Center for Global Humanities. Now, this is something that has to go through the normal bureaucratic channels and so on, but the steering committee has voted on this, has decided this, and so this is what will happen. And this is going to mirror what we've already decided also in the department. So the Department of Humanities will now be the Department of Global Humanities. The reason for this is that we wanted to move in the department away from a Eurocentric focus, a strictly Eurocentric focus, and think about the humanities in a truly global sense, which in some ways is hubristic because our department is quite small. And global doesn't just mean, of or pertaining to the globe or the larger world, but global also tends to suggest global coverage, meaning that we could adequately cover the totality, as it were, of cultures and traditions, which we can't do. So we recognize the hubristic nature of this. But nonetheless, I think that decentering the Eurocentric understanding of the humanities is very much what we want to do. At the Institute for the Humanities, soon to become Center for Global Humanities, I think this is something we have been doing now for some time. And this is not least to do with the projects that we've done in, say, last 5 years or so. And we've done a lot of work with Vladimir and had focused a fair amount on Brazil. We've also looked at the situation in India, in the United States, and other parts of the world. So I think we'd already been developing a global focus. So I think this is really good for us. And this evening is a great example of a globally focused humanities. It takes up questions that, in a way, remain in dialogue with the European tradition, but also try to push beyond that. And I think that's actually materially reflected in the film that we'll be discussing shortly. So I now want to just move to introducing our panel. First and foremostly, we have the subject of the film, Vladimir Safatle, who's professor of philosophy and psychology at the University of São Paulo, who has also been a visiting scholar at UC Berkeley, as well as an invited professor at Université de Paris and Toulouse, as well as Louvain. Vladimir has also contributed to a book that we organized at the Institute called Spectres of Fascism. And indeed, a couple of years ago, when I was visiting professor at the University of São Paulo, we had a discussion, and that was subsequently published in the journal Crisis. And I'll post a link for people if they're interested, because a lot of the themes, in a sense, that appear in the film are reflected in the conversation that we had. Secondly, we have John Abromeit, who's professor of history at State University of New York, Buffalo State. He is the author of Max Horkheimer and Transformation in Europe and in the Americas, History and Recent Tendencies, which was published by Bloomsbury in 2016. And the Horkheimer book was published by Cambridge University Press in 2011. I've known John since the middle of the 90s when we met at UC Berkeley, and we've been friends ever since, and we've done many projects together, and he's spoken also many times at the Institute. And finally, last but not least, we have Miriam Maduraira, who's currently a professor of philosophy at the Humanities Department of the Universidade Autónoma Metropolitana. Oh boy, I don't think I'm going to pronounce that correctly, so I won't bother. And has been a fellow of the Forschungskolleg Humanwissenschaften of the Goethe Universität in Frankfurt am Main. Now, I think that the order that we had agreed upon is slightly different than the order that's listed. I think we'll have Miriam start off. We're going to have Vladimir first speak and set up the film and provide a bit of background for us. Then we'll go to Miriam, John, and then if there's a bit of time left over, I'll speak at the end, and then we'll open it up for discussion. I think we also wanted to have a few minutes for Vladimir to respond to the panelists' remarks before going to question and answer. So let me turn it over now to Vladimir. Welcome.
Well, thank you so much, Samir, and thank you so much for the presence of Miriam, of John, and all the people that are seeing us now. So first of all, I would express my gratitude for this space. For us, it's a very important space. Well, not just about the movie, not because the movie, but because it's an opportunity to talk a little bit more about the Brazilian situation. That is not just something that concerns us as Brazilians, but also if we are right that we are seeing Brazil a kind of world laboratory for a type of neoliberalism, authoritarian neoliberalism, with a very fascist tendencies, inner tendencies. And the use of this term is not just a rhetorical one, it's just it's really analytical one. Then for us, it's important to try to present the situation as clear as possible for have some kind of, let's say, help in the other international forums. Well, first of all, I would express also my gratitude to Samir. Well, we are doing a collective work for, I don't know, 3 years or something like that. And it's especially for me, it's a source of real intellectual pleasure, our debates, and I can just wait sometimes that this can last for as long as possible. I would also thank Miriam to accept to take part of that, and also John. Well, I would try to be short because for me it's very important to know what you think about that, and also to preserve time for our debate. I will just say that, well, this movie was made thinking upon, let's say, a kind of thing that developed itself in 3 main axes. The first one, let's say the structural one, the idea was to present the inner contradictions on the position of intellectuals at all, in a certain way. These intellectuals that are, let's say, take between, be a part of an institution that also is a part of the material reproduction of life in capitalist societies, not just the universities, but also let's say this space and the media, the space where the things that we do at university can circulate outside the university. We have this, let's say, this role, but also we try to preserve a certain tradition of critical thinking. We try to put this forward. We try to be let's say, faithful to this desire, desire to be a part of a critical movement concerning, let's say, the limitations proper to our society, our form of life. This was the first axis, the structural one. There was also a second one that concerned, let's say, the Brazilian situation, because, as you know, we are in the kind of process of unbelievable degradation, not just a political degradation, but also a social one, because we are facing to our history of a Brazilian fascism that is a research that is very strong. For giving an idea, for example, at the 30s, Brazil had one of the biggest fascist parties outside Europe. 1,200,000 persons were adherent of the Brazilian fascist party that called it Aliança Integralista Nacional. Of course, this stayed in Brazil, and we can understand that because Brazil, is in a certain way, is the biggest necropolitical experiment in America. 30% of all persons that was enslaved in Africa was directed to Brazil. As an economist like Celso Furtado normally said, Brazil was first economical experiment, and after we create a society. And this economical spirit was the big plantation, big slavish plantation linked to exportation of primary commodities like sugarcane, coffee, and so on. This is the reason that we stayed as a country that used slavery until almost the beginning of the 20th century. Of course, this established a society marked by a type of civil war and a very strong civil war marked by racism, marked by these military structures that stayed in our history. And we are facing that now without any unification, without any political alternative. Well, of course, this changed a little bit now, but actually we see the limit of the political imagination in Brazilian society. And we are asking ourselves why this happened with us. And we decided to make a kind of movement of self-criticism, because we believe that if we are in this situation, it's because all political actors failed. The intellectual class failed. The classical political actors failed too. The social movements, the trade unions, and the parties, and all these things were not able to deal with this kind, let's say, or challenging in the Brazilian society. And of course, Brazil is a country that represents 40% of all the Latin American GDP. Then you can imagine the tension that it's proper to a country that occupy a geopolitical position like us. And this was the second exit, because we decided to do something like, well, if we want a self-criticism of all the political actors concerning to progressive politics, let's start by us. Let's start by ourselves. Let's start by the intellectual class. And then we tried to create some situations, and these situations were a kind of psychodramas, because we put people together. We just gave some minimal identifications, like, well, this will be this type of scenario, and you should try to do that and that. And the people just was, let's say, moved by the situation. Then there was not a script, there was nothing like that. this was a kind of experiment, let's say a social experiment, with the results that we saw. This was the second axis. And the third axis was a type, let's say, a personal one, because I was a person that tried many things in these last years. And I'm very conscious of the limitations of these essays. And I wanted to try to think together what happened with these ideas and these essays, and we decided that to put this in a kind of theatrical situation could be the best thing to do. These were the three axes that moved the movie. And I would like just to point one more thing that is important for me. Maybe, let's say, the result of that, the result of this experiment. Well, each person that was concerned with this experiment have his own perspective. Let's say, have his own idea what was the result of that. But for me, something that was very clear at the end is it's concerning the music that appear in the movie, because every position is marked by music. I played music. The other protagonists, the Palomares, that do something with me, sing. Also sing. She sings samba. Well, the people that came from the suburb, they also played music. They sang a rap at the end. And let's say the idea is this is a type of particular type of sensibilities, particular type of dealing with feelings, with what someone tried to express. And of course, the question is there a place where all this music can come together? And the answer is, it's a certain way, no. But as, let's say, as Schoenberg had shown that for us once, well, maybe the only thing that is able to do is try to create upon a dissonance field, a dissonant field, create upon dissonance, emancipate this dissonance, accept that we are dealing with a kind of political body that has many different intensities, many different traditions, many different ways to understand affects and sensibility. And if you are able to, in a certain way, put all these perspectives in a kind of creative dissonance, maybe we can produce a new political body. Let's say this was one of the results of this movie for me.
Thank you very much, Vladimir. Let's now turn to Miriam.
Thank you very much for the invitation, also from Samir, John, and also Vladimir. I was trying to make a sort of reconstruction or attempt to make sense out of the whole different scenes of the film, because I think it's quite difficult. It's obviously not a story. It's a sort of essay film. I have seen it described as essay film, and I think the perfect description. And I was trying to understand, is there a main thesis here? How can we interpret what is going on here? And what can we say about it? And so I have some remarks I'm going to half read and half comment on. And I don't think it's going to take too long. I hope you can see me while I speak this. Okay. I have thing here. Okay. I try to make sense out of it, and it makes a lot of sense, a lot of interesting things to discuss here, but I try to make a sort of whole story out of it, not a story, but a sort of interpretation. And I called it dialectics of disenlightenment. I don't know if it's possible to interpret like this. I'm reinforcing a little bit, but I'm going to read it this way. So I'm going to half read, half comment on it. Eagoraoque, I'm going to start here, can be regarded as an essay film. It's a documentary, half fiction, half reality. It's not very clear sometimes where fiction starts or where it ends. There are many places we can tell directly that they did happen because they were filmed by other people as well beforehand. But the mixture is really very interesting. And on a first level, it has to do with present Brazilian situation, the rise of the far right, Bolsonaro 2018. The film, as far as I understand, was filmed in 2018 around Bolsonaro's election. But still before the whole catastrophe that had been going on since the coup against Dilma Rousseff, but before his government really started and before COVID pandemic and the whole catastrophe we have now with almost more than 260,000 dead people, and it's going to rise still. Also, before the main thing, but while he was rising. But it has not only to do with Brazilian situation because it goes beyond that. And I have decided to talk mostly about what has to do with more than Brazil, because actually about Brazil, it's not so much shown for people who don't know exactly what happened in the last years in Brazil. But there's a lot to say about the possibility of political action or transformation, and questions like, in what direction should it go? How should the left be understood? How should the left behave? Which left we are talking about? Mostly from left, obviously, the transformation. Who is the left? With whom should we act? How should we act? And maybe we could summarize that by how are we going to get out of this? That's what Jean-Claude Bernadette says at a certain point of the film. How we're going to get out of this. As I understand this film as an essay, I was asking, does it defend a thesis? There is a main thesis that conducts the whole thing, or is there something that could organize the whole argumentation, a statement? I would say, regarding the first level of the debate, this has to do with the rise of the far right in Brazil. It doesn't say very much. Maybe only there are a couple of short remarks of the main character and at the same time Vladimir himself, who is not just the character. Says something like the far right doesn't get into power except if the left has betrayed its destiny. And that's something he has just said something similar. And the statement that the left, and maybe not only Brazil, is reactive, not being able to propose anything, just reacting to situations without being able to invent something new. However important it might be to discuss this, I think it's very important to discuss this, and I agree with almost everything that Vladimir says. I think it's not the main point of the film. I think it's obviously a film made out of perplexity, especially this perplexity before the difficulties of organizing any sort of democratic emancipatory movement, considering the complexities of contemporary society. The whole debate is made from the perspective of the privileged left intellectual and his contradictions. And if it has a thesis, I will argue in this sense, maybe we can discuss it later. It seems to be a paradoxical, a poetical thesis. The way out is no way out, at least yet, for the time being. So, Vladimir has just spoken about X's. I also tried to organize this as a coincidence. Maybe I did see X's, but I tried to, I saw mainly two X's organizing the debate on political action, considering this part of political action. And these two axes, I have regarded them as being discussed from the perspective of mostly the engaged, privileged left intellectuals, this perspective that has the main character, and it's where the whole film is filmed. But this has also three different positions. The two axes regard ends and means of democratic struggle. I try to organize it like this, related to the ends of political action, but also at a certain point to its means. we find the question of what democracy is. Here there's a tension, I would say, between universalism and difference, which appear at different points in different senses. For instance, mostly twice directions, I would say. So the question of the possibility of establishing alliances among different struggles or maintaining fragmentation understood as diversity of class and of identity struggles like feminist, Black movement, LGBT, and so on. And in both cases, alliances and diversity, we have a question of inclusion or exclusion. And we can see this question as related to particular struggles being or not being integrated into a main struggle, such as class struggle, maintaining difference, or the question of exclusion or being excluded from these struggles, and also the question of exclusion understood as inequality. That's not diversity, but difference as inequality. The possibility of being included into society as a whole, like when they discuss the possibilities of including peripheral people into main society through community banks, which is a question that has been discussed as it's actually an inclusion in capitalist entrepreneur mentality. Well, I see this considering the end, the idea of democracy between inclusion, exclusion, universality, and diversity, and related to the means of achieving it, I see an important act also in the question of whether this inclusion or whatever, this relationship between the different struggles can be achieved, may or should be achieved through words, that is debate and argumentation, or through violence. The question of violence is very present in the film as well. And both words and violence permeate the whole essay in different constellations and different outcomes. We can discuss them later. I would say these two axes, the ends and means, and the question of universality, diversity, violence, argumentation, are discussed from three positions already from the perspective of the engaged, privileged left intellectual, not from other perspectives which are also present in the film, but the film is obviously from this position. Starts from the position of the privileged, engaged intellectual, left intellectual. Well, there are the three main characters, or three of the main characters which are from this side, who are also real people. The father, who is Jean-Claude Bernadette, representing I would say he has to do with the old school 1968 political activism, to whom struggle meant, regarding the ends, mostly class struggle, trade unions, political parties, a certain verticality. And regarding the means, it has to do with the occupation of public spaces, like meetings, going to the streets, but possibly including the use of violence as well. The daughter, on the other side, the father, the daughter, who may be the real doctor, I'm not very sure here, but the daughter who is active in contemporary student movements, representing contemporary struggles, characterized by, I would say, the father verticality, the daughter horizontality, a certain tendency to assemblyism, I could say, so the tendency of deciding everything in meetings and collective discussions horizontally, and to immediate collective action encompassing all the so-called identity struggles, not only, but more than the father anyway, so mainly identity struggles. And regarding the ends of the struggles associated with an inclusive but maybe less defined conception of democracy, regarding means by the power of collective, but maybe somehow naive debate. Sounded to me that there was also this aspect here. And then the main character between both, I would say, Safatle, Vladimir, the university professor, I would say he tries to oscillate between both, although he has his own position. Regarding means, I would say he insists mostly on the power of argumentation against violence. The debate was, as an university professor, should do, or what is expected actually from an university professor, as a means of inclusion. And regarding the ends, the sort of, I would describe the sort of thing I think he represents as an implicit universalistic conception of democracy, which is understood by himself as being open to all sorts of perspectives. And at a certain point is described as being beyond present capitalist society. Maybe central for his conception is the last main scene. I think it's a very important scene in the film, where the university professor debates democratic struggle with these young, poor, mostly Black people from some peripheral favela, probably from São Paulo, where he goes to this room where he's debating with these young people at the end of the film. Confronted by them with points of view which insist on the impossibility of establishing a common struggle among people from different access to rights and to different sorts of privilege, he insists on the possibility of dialogical construction of a common we. But he only receives his own privilege as reflected from his debaters. He's excluded, actually, from those he wanted to include. And this reflection contains a great deal of violence as well. His own privilege is reflected. There is a lot of aggression also in the debate. And his attempt of establishing an inclusive dialogue is itself interpreted as a sort of violence, as a sort of trying to include other points of view in his own point of view. Eagoraoque, no? Is inclusive debate a form of violence that can only be opposed by exclusive violence in the form of debate? A trial here. The film leaves this question open. In a certain sense, it does answer it without answering it directly. If we take into account that the whole essay is filmed from the perspective of the engaged intellectual, maybe the film operates a sort of implicit violent exclusion of those the main character perspective was supposed to include. So it could be also seen as a sort of performative contradiction, a film about communicative inclusion which excludes from communication part of those who are supposed to be included. Those young people are probably never going to watch the film anyway. Maybe, as always, the only alternative is to insist in the power of words in spite of its contradictions. In this sense, I wanted to say there is something apoetical here, but there is the only way out should be the way out of insisting on the power of words, and maybe even hurdling words which are quoted in the film, that where danger is, grows the saving power as well. That might mean what was also mentioned in the film, that creativity or the new can only appear at times of despair. Something like that was said by, I think, Vladimir's character. So that's what I had to say here. These two axes and this idea of these apoetical ends, I don't know the solution to, but I think we have to insist into the power of words.
Thank you very much, Miriam. Over to you, John.
Okay, can everybody hear me okay? Okay, all right, well, I'd like to thank Samir a lot for the invitation. It's an honor and a privilege to discuss this very interesting and rich film with you guys. I'd also like to thank Louvain for organizing this event. Vladimir said he'd like to have some non-Brazilians involved in the discussion of the film. So as a partial disclaimer, I can say that I play that role. I have had an abiding interest in Brazil for about 20 years now, although I'm by no means an expert on Brazil. So my hope is that I know enough to pose some interesting questions tonight. So I'd like to use the film as a way of thinking about different types of intellectuals in Brazil, but also hopefully elsewhere. So I think, as Vladimir stated, and Miriam picked up on this as well, the film presents a self-reflexive critique of the traditional leftist academic intellectual, whose task it is to bring critical consciousness to oppressed groups based on the presupposition that these groups wouldn't attain a critical or revolutionary consciousness without the intellectual bringing it to them. So it's, the classical Leninist model of the intellectual. Now, as an alternative, I want to just remind everybody of Gramsci's notion of the organic intellectual. And of course, Gramsci argued that everyone is an intellectual, but only a few people actually play this role, have this function within society. Now, according to Gramsci, organic intellectuals emerge out of subaltern groups. They express ideas common within these groups, and in so doing, they contribute to the formation of counter-hegemonic consciousness in society. I want to discuss 3 different examples of organic intellectuals in Brazil that are present in the film, I think. And one of them is directly present, and the other 2 I'm going to introduce as types, which I think find correspondences in the film. So the first one, the first model of an organic intellectual is Mano Brown, who makes a brief appearance in the film. Mano Brown is a musician from the São Paulo area. He grew up in a favela in the southern part of São Paulo. He had no formal education. As a young person, he had several run-ins with the police, but he made a name for himself as a hip-hop artist or rapper. He's won several major awards for his music, but he's consistently refused to engage with the mainstream media, or as the father figure calls it, in the father character in the film, the bourgeois press, right? Mano Brown has given very few interviews and no TV performances. He performs mainly inside of the favelas. He also insists that anyone wanting to improve conditions in the favelas must be able to speak the language of the people, right? And one could see his music as a vehicle for cultivating a type of counter-hegemonic consciousness. I mean, I think there are interesting parallels here with Debord as well, and Debord's refusal to engage with the media at all, right? But should we interpret his rejection of the media and the language of elites as an affirmation of the autonomy of the marginalized underclass in the periferia, right, the favelas in Brazil? And this seems to be the position which is taken in the film by the young people from the favela in the scene which Miriam just mentioned at the end of the film, where these young people basically say that they don't need the help of the white or the academic left, right? They confidently proclaim that they're already self-organized, right? And Vladimir, ironically, his character, ironically responds that maybe it's in fact the white academic left that is unable to self-organize, right? Or alternatively, could one view the position of Mano Brown and the young people from the favela as a stubborn refusal to see their own oppression within a larger context and to admit that they could learn something from left academics? Mano Brown himself in the film says at one point that many poor people in Brazil are conservative and that they identify with some of the values of the ruling elite, what I think Samir has talked about in other contexts as identifying with the aggressor, right? So the Brazilians who do not appear in the film, but whom I would like to mention as 2 other models of organic intellectuals, are the former president, Luiz Ignacio da Silva, better known, of course, as Lula, and Marielle Franco, politician and activist from Rio de Janeiro, who was assassinated in 2018. So again, I'm not assuming a lot of knowledge about Brazil. I'm just going to say a little bit more about Lula and Marielle. So Like Mano Brown, Lula came from extremely humble circumstances. He was born the 7th of 8 children to a poor family that immigrated from the northeast of Brazil to São Paulo in order to find work. Lula left school after 2nd grade, started working at the age of 12. In his teens, he began working in the industrial region of São Bernardo do Campo, south of São Paulo. He was involved in an industrial accident. He lost a finger and had trouble getting healthcare, which led him to get more involved in the union movement in the auto factory where he worked. He became active in the trade union movement. He was elected president of the Steelworkers Union in 1975. He helped organize strikes during the military dictatorship. In February of 1980, Lula helped found, together with a number of Brazilian intellectuals, the Partido dos Trabalhadores, the PT, and as the leader of the PT, he ran for president 3 times unsuccessfully before finally being elected in 2002. While in office, Lula carried out a number of social programs, including the Bolsa Família, which helped put an end to child labor in Brazil and lifted many millions of Brazilians out of poverty. Lula could be seen as an extremely successful organic intellectual who was willing to work with more traditional academic intellectuals in order to bring about a significant social change for many poor and marginalized Brazilians. Defenders of Lula would point out that the key to the successes of the PT was precisely his ability to create a mass following among poor Brazilians, which enabled the PT to win victories at the ballot box and enact progressive legislation. Critics of Lula and the PT from a more radical left position would focus on the compromises that Lula made with ruling elites in order to come to power, which may have prevented him from bringing about a more radical transformation of Brazilian society. And I think perhaps we could identify Lula's position to some extent with the father figure in the film, as Miriam just pointed out, of someone who came up through the union movement, trade union movement, and emphasized a more traditional leftist position. Okay. So the final figure I'd like to mention is Marielle Franco, who also, like Mano Brown and Lula, came from very humble circumstances. She was born in 1975 and was raised in Maré, which is a favela in the northern part of Rio de Janeiro. She started working at the age of 11, but also stayed in school and finished her education, high school education. Marielle had a daughter when she was 19. She raised this daughter by herself. She worked as a preschool teacher and attended university on the side. She completed a master's degree, an MA in the social sciences in 2014 with a thesis on the UPP, which is the federal police force created to try to take back control of the favelas in Rio from the gangs in the favelas. And during this time, Marielle also became active politically in a number of different groups, fighting for the rights of favela residents against police violence, but also for women's and LGBTQ rights. She identified openly as a lesbian and lived with her longtime female partner. In 2016, she was elected to the city council in Rio, where she represented the radical left party, PSOL, which I believe Vladimir has also been involved with PSOL. I don't know if Vladimir wants to say something about that later. Marielle quickly became a widely recognized figure in Brazil and even internationally for her political activism. But in 2018, she was assassinated by far-right vigilante militia units with ties to the current president of Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro. For my purposes here, I would just like to emphasize that unlike Mano Brown or Lula, Marielle was an organic intellectual who obtained and clearly benefited from her university education. Her MA thesis helped her gain a more sophisticated understanding of the social and political forces that were arrayed against people like her. could we see Marielle as an example of a successful communication between academic intellectuals and organic intellectuals? Also, I'd like to suggest that she represents a type of intersectional politics that were defended by the Black student, the Black female student in the film, who remained engaged with her community. So I think this is a kind of corresponding character in the film with Marielle, right? And maybe her character was even based on Marielle, I don't know, but okay. So again, and just the last type of intellectual that we see in the film is, of course, Vladimir himself, which, with apologies, Vladimir, I'm going to call the non-organic intellectual. Okay. But so it mixes the professor and the public intellectual. I mean, those, of course, are two separate roles as well. I mean, certainly not all professors are critical public intellectuals, but the roles often get conflated in the film. For example, in the scene at the end, which Miriam discussed, with the discussion between Vladimir and the young residents of the favela, he approaches them as a critical intellectual, but they see him very suspiciously as a white professor, right? One of the central themes of the film is this disjunct between the socially privileged, well-educated, non-organic intellectual and the quote unquote, the people, right, whom his radical politics are intended to benefit. The question Vladimir himself raises in this scene is how more successful alliances could be formed between non-organic intellectuals like himself and the real or potential organic intellectuals in the favela. So I'd like to suggest two possible answers. First, professors and traditional intellectuals must first recognize the diversity of different types of intellectuals and must give up any pretense of monopolizing the role of intellectuals. I think this is what Vladimir himself just said as well, speaking of dissonance and sort of accepting dissonance. And so, I think in the different figures of Mano Brown, Lula, Marielle, we see already three different types of organic intellectuals. And secondly, I think we professors, I speak here myself as a professor, and non-organic intellectuals need to ask how we can aid the development of organic intellectuals. How can we share the knowledge and power that we have, which can help them more effectively defend their communities? It seems like Marielle's university education might be a good model of how this could work. But in conclusion, I would also like to suggest that we must also be willing to criticize and challenge the assumptions of our students, regardless of their backgrounds. Mano Brown, for example, refuses to romanticize poor people. The film gives us several examples of a tendentially authoritarian, populist anti-intellectualism as well, which I think we have to be very wary of. I wrote a book on Max Horkheimer, and Horkheimer formulated the role of the intellectual as being neither free-floating as purely objective above the fray, but not being firmly rooted either. So criticizing, he's criticizing Lukács's idea that there's an epistemological privilege of the proletariat, and intellectuals just have to do that. Intellectuals also have to maintain their independence from the people. And so in this sense, I think traditional intellectuals do also still have a role to play. So that's it.
Thanks very much, John. So what I think I'm going to do is just pass on any kind of formal remarks. I will have maybe some questions later for Vladimir, but I think right now, maybe you could spend a couple of minutes, Vladimir, by just responding. I think you have some very interesting questions that have come out of these two sets of remarks. If you could keep it brief, that would be great. And then I'd like to invite people in. I should have said this at the outset, but if people would like to ask questions, just please put them in the chat dialog box, and I will read them out for the purposes of the recording. The panelists will be able to see them as well, but I'll read them out. So Vladimir, a couple of minutes just in response, and then I'd like to hear from the audience.
Okay. Well, first, thank you so much for Miriam and John for these remarks. They are for me, it's very important remarks. I think they point very important topics. Well, I would just start with the Miriam's remarks, saying that it's true that we tried to express, let's say, a type of conflict between different positions that are very representative for the Brazilian society, but maybe it was not exactly a distinction between universalistic position and some position that support, let's say, politics of difference or something like that. Because what we're trying to show is how complicated is to construct a necessary alliance against something that needs, let's say, that asks us, let's say, resistance that came from everywhere. Because something like the Brazilian state, a state that is organized for, let's say, managed implicit civil war, that we know very well how this is really a very strict description of the situation that some vulnerable sectors of the Brazilian society understand the Brazilian state. To stop with that, it's something that asks us a kind of multiple action that came a little bit from everywhere. And if this is true, because it's very interesting to remember how, for example, when Bolsonaro came to power, he started to fight against three main sectors. Well, these vulnerable people that live in suburbs, the artists, and the academic class. And I would insist in this point, because let's say the relation to the universities, the relation with the schools, they became a very tense relation inside this government. And maybe we could ask why this type of, let's say, multiple fights, multiple struggles created by this government. It's because the government understands that if there is a kind of alliance between all these sectors, a project like this project will be impossible. And I insist in this point because I don't think it's the problem of universalistic perspective, because if we put a distinction between identity struggles and universalistic perspective, I would just insist. I think that what we call identity struggle is the real universalistic struggles, because they are just saying the universal doesn't exist already, doesn't exist yet. And if you want that this exists, we should be able to point to nominate all the structures of violence that constitute our society. But I think, and then I can go also to some remarks made by John. I think that if we have some type of function in this process, is to insist on the limits of some strategies. Of course, I'm very pleased with this John's remark, saying, well, I will put you in a type of non-organic intellectual. For me, it's great, because I think that we have a position to play in this situation, because all these organics intellectuals, especially, for example, you mentioned Lula also as a type of organic intellectual. Well, all these projects showed a type of limit inside the Brazilian society. For example, what has happened with us today, it's incomprehensible if we don't accept that it's a type of result of inner contradictions inside a project that Lula had represented. It's a type of leftist populism that was able to organize some big conciliatory pacts that create some possibilities that you described, concerning, let's say, politics against inequality and so on. But we saw that this create, let's say, a very fragile situation. A fragile situation where, in a certain way, we lost everything. We are in a very complicated possibility of resistance, exactly because this type of program has its own inner contradictions. And a good question is to ask, well, who speak about these contradictions? For example, one of the contradictions that appeared in the movie, it's concerning, let's say, this way to try to let's say, to create social emancipation upon the idea of a kind of suburb entrepreneurs. Then we saw, for example, these popular banks, that was working that this bank, it existed, it exists. It's not just a creation of the movie. And well, of course, that there is some risks, some limits in this type of strategy. One of these limits is, well, we are understanding social emancipation as something that can be constructed upon the moment that some people at the suburbs are seen as entrepreneurs. If we don't, of course, we can also say, well, but there is the urgency. We should try to find some way to put these people out of the poverty and so on. But of course, we know that the power organize itself upon the, let's say, the management of the urgency. It tried to say as well, there is no way out. There is no choice. We need to accept that. And someone that is insist in something that for this actual structure of the society can sound as impossible. It's funny, but has a type of importance. I think so. Because it's something, it's a way to say we cannot be just enslaved by the limits of our own strategies. This is one point. The second point is when you insist in this difference, not different types of intellectuals, but also the difference between, let's say, what appears especially in the final debate. I would insist. I don't know if you had this impression, but I had the impression that it's not exactly a debate between someone that came from the intellectual class and groups of people from the suburbs. It's a debate between two intellectual positions. And I would also say two academic positions, because this discourse is a discourse that we listen in our academic field. And it's a discourse that try in a certain way to demobilize. I would insist in this point, some potencies and powers that came from another type of tradition, of critical tradition. And in the Brazilian situations, the tradition that came from the Marxist perspective. For example, let's just insist in one point. There is a moment where the people from the suburbs said, well, the left never talked about racism in Brazil. What is false? It's simply false. We should forget, Celso Furtado should forget Florestan Fernandes, just to talk about the academic left. But it's very interesting what happened there, because it's a way to say there is no way to rescue, to preserve some histories of battles and struggles that came before. Of course, we can also always say, but these struggles weren't able to make some context, to resonate these other struggles that came from other classes and so on. what is the question to discuss? Okay.
Vladimir, do you mind if I hold you there? Thank you very much
Okay.
for those responses. But we do have some excellent questions from the audience, which I'd like to go to now. So the first is actually from a student of mine who's studying film at SFU. Thank you very much for the fascinating discussion. The film points towards an awareness of the film medium at times in the peaking of the audio, the handheld camera's shakiness, and the pausing of a discussion at one point. These elements were important to me because they allowed the film to be seen as part of a discussion. I wondered if Vladimir could speak on how much of the filming style was a result of the collaboration of him with the filmmakers. Also more broadly, what role can films play in generating contact between the intellectual and the working class to enact political change? Very interesting question, I think.
Sorry, where is this question? I tried
it's in
to
the
find
Q&A. You see it at the bottom. There's it says Q&A. It's not in chat. It's in the Q&A.
Okay, sorry. Okay, I found it. Yeah, actually, well, first, the filmmakers present something very open. Then I was able also to change some things, to insist in some points, and especially this film was not made by just two persons. No? Jean-Claude Bernardet and Ruben Revel, that was the main directors of the film, but also for people, because we gave the direction for different people. For example, when we are talking in this feminist debate, it's a woman that is directing. No? Well, this discussion on the suburbs, it's someone from the suburbs that is directing the movie. No? And we had this idea, let's say, to give the direction for other persons, no? to really insist in this kind of dialogical structure of the movie. No?
Fascinating. Yeah, thank you. So we have another question from Deborah Alves. My question is for Vladimir. Do you still believe that it's possible to create a united force to not only react, but also act, important distinction, towards a more just society in Brazil, or the damage created by the current government will the damage created by the current government make it impossible?
I think so, but I think that we need to give a better answer for two main problems. Because, for example, now Brazil, and especially the academic class, is working against identitarianism, for something like that. Everybody's talking about that. And I would insist that I don't think that we can put this problem in this way. Because we should really remember that if you want to start talking against identitarianism, you should start with criticizing what we can say as a kind of white identitarianism. That this is let's say, the strongest identitarianism that we know, and we should also remember that identity politics is something that is a kind of risk present in every political strategy. We know, for example, how the Marxist tradition had transformed, let's say, the proletariat in a kind of identity subject that represent a type of state, a type of culture, a type of nation, and so on. Then I think that this debate is a very bad debate. This is the first thing. The positions are not very good. And the second thing is, well, one more time, we discovered that we have 30% of voters, electors in Brazil that is strongly identified with a fascist politics. In this situation, we need also to think in other types of alliance. And I'm afraid that we are totally waiting for, let's say, some old perspectives in politics, that it's all that we need, all that we have now, and putting put in the secondary place this type of problem.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to turn now to a question from Sven Robinson, who is a legendary parliamentarian in Canada and is also now and is associated with our department as a J.S. Woodsworth visiting scholar. So 2 questions, Vladimir, you can also see them, but I'm going to read them out. What is the significance of Lula's potential candidacy in the next presidential election, and how has the PT changed since he stepped down? And what do you see as the role of cultural leaders in fighting fascism and neoliberalism in Brazil? Artists, musicians, writers, poets, remembering how important they were in fighting Pinochet in Chile, and perhaps having the respect of those young Black activists who are so cynical about politicians and academics.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for the question. I think it's a very important one. The first thing, well, it's about Lula. It's true that Lula is the best alternative against Bolsonaro now, because he is he's the only that can have a strong electoral performance. But I think that this is something important for us. But this also shows the limit of the political imagination in Brazilian left. Because one more time, well, Lula was responsible for a very strong conciliatory politics that put us in this type of situation. He is really the representation of that. And this conciliatory politics was obliged to, in a certain way, preserve very conservative structures that were responsible for the coup in Dilma Rousseff. The one thing that is really amazing in Brazilian situation is if you think you should take, for example, the Ministry of Michel Temer, the one that made a coup against Dilma Rousseff. You see all the integrants of the older ministries of Lula and Dilma. What showed that this was almost a kind of inner coup d'etat. Because the alliance was so strong, so big that in a certain way, we create this kind of field of equivalence. In this field of equivalence, put some different demands in the same level. Also, the demands of the oligarchy that were discontent with the hegemony structure of the oligarchy. Well, this is one point. I think that, well, we don't have time for another option, and we weren't able to create another option. Well, about the importance of singers, of artists in this process, I think that they are totally important. But I would stress one point, because you mentioned the Chilean situation. And the Chilean situation was strong because it was a global fight for a global change. For example, what we see now, for example, after 2019 mobilizations that obliged the Chilean government to ask for a new constitution. What was interesting for us is, well, they were able to create a field of very different political demands, organized upon a structure of criticism of a neoliberal politics, and same neoliberal politics that transformed in the 70s and the 80s the Chile in a kind of world laboratory for that. And I think that this is something that is lacking in Brazilian perspective. Let's say this understanding that we should organize themselves upon a type of a strong and structural demand of change.
Thanks, Vladimir. And by the way, if people are interested in this interview that we did, this conversation that we had, I've tried to access it, but the website of Crisis is down. If people are interested in Sven, we can obviously talk about this, but if others are interested, just contact me and I'll send it to you. There are a lot of these issues that we go into in some detail. As we do a little bit around the book published by Andres Zinger that was reviewed, interestingly, a very interesting review in the London Review of Books by Perry Anderson, where he talks about some of the real shortcomings of Lula. Two things that come up. First of all, an appeal to the poor as if they were members of a middle class, which raised expectations and then created a kind of catastrophe when there was an economic and political crisis. And the other thing was the anti-intellectualism of Lula. This is something that comes out and I think might respond interestingly to John's point about Lula as being an organic intellectual. But he was somebody, according to Singer, who really discouraged inner criticism within the party of his leadership and of the party's direction. So I think that's important. Now we have another question in the chat from Luciano from Brasilia. I'd like to ask Vladimir, in this kind of scenario that we live in Brazil, which main political affect, or which is a kind of political affect of indifference for human needs, how could we find a way to change this? So the key thing here is that the predominant affect is an indifference for human needs. One could say suffering. I mean, I think the pandemic seems to suggest this. Your reference to necropolitics seems to also suggest this. So how can this be changed? Very interesting question.
Yeah, I would stress 2 points. The first one is it's clear that one of the major problems in Brazilian society is this connection between violence and state. The state is the manager of a strong violence against not just now vulnerable sectors of the population, but also the state is a structure that in a way produce this type of discourse of indifference, produce the circulation of this discourse of indifference in the Brazilian society. And this is a part of, let's say, a biggest politics, because if you want to install a kind of strong neoliberal laboratory in Brazil, we need indifference. We need indifference as the major political effect. And then if this is the case, it's very important, for example, for a leftist perspective, to understand how the destruction of this type of state, it's a base of every politics in Brazil. Because I insist in this point, we have 13 years of leftist government in Brazil, and we have nothing have done to in a certain way, the structure, to destroy this relation between violence and state. For example, we have a political, a military policy, police in Brazil. Until now, we have all the space that was preserved by the army was respected by this 13 years old of 30 years of leftist government. Then I think that this should be a major point in our perspectives in our programs. And the second point is against this effect of indifference. We need to find a way to think about what is a generic solidarity as a strong political effect. And how we can put the problem of a generic solidarity as a main axis of our discourse and our debates.
Thank you, Vladimir. We have still some questions remaining, but I think many of those have been answered in your answers as well. So we have just a couple of minutes left. I'm wondering if, just to bring John and Miriam back into the discussion, would you like to have any final thoughts before we conclude? Either of you.
I think the point you raised just now, Samir, is an interesting one. It comes out in your interview with Vladimir as well. This idea that the poor people who benefited from, say, the Bolsa Familia, this program which tried to end, child labor, and did in fact lift a lot of people out of poverty during the Lula government. But many of these people who then were upwardly mobile, they then refuse to support. I mean, it's a phenomenon we see in many different places, right? The sort of the upward mobility leads to a more conservative or even authoritarian politics. But how do you deal with that? I mean, I think that's a problem we're seeing in the United States as well, in many places. I mean, it's an old problem, and it's the old problem of Nazi Germany in some ways as well, right? I don't know if Vladimir has any thoughts on that, or Miriam, but
yeah. Well, I mean, let's leave that as a kind of standing question.
Okay.
We don't have to answer everything now, but I think that's a really key one, and it does come up. Vladimir actually articulates this, or your character in the film articulates this this question of sort of kind of love of one's own oppression, and I think that's an enduring question.
And Mano Brown as well says that in the film.
That's right.
That's interesting. So
yeah, the conservatism of the poor.
Yeah.
Miriam, any final thoughts?
You have to unmute.
Yeah, about this point, on this point, I would say it's mainly the conservatism of the middle classes, actually, who never accepted that the poor could do more than they were expected to do. There's a typical question of poor people on planes flying to other places. I think there are lots of resentment of the middle classes, because up to a certain point, the most miserable did get much better, and the most rich also got what they wanted. So there was something in between that was completely crushed. I think that this middle class, which has always this sort of resentment that goes to the right, and some part of the poor maybe as well. I think that would be my explanation of that. And about the conciliation of Lula, of course, it's true, but I think they should have done at least a political, a media, and a tax reform when they were able to. But I'm not very sure how much more they could have done, or if Lula wouldn't have been expelled from government on 2003, if he had tried more than he tried. I think that at a certain point they should have tried some more, at least a little more reforms of the police. The police. This PM, the military police. Well, there are lots of things could have been done, but only when they were at the high of their most popular moment. I'm not very sure how much more they could have done. I'm not sure. I'm actually sure they won't be able to do much more than they have done if Lula is elected again. But anyway, it's a lot of difference, and I think it should be. Well, we hope this happens, I think it's mostly that. But I think there's a lot of fascist coincidence with what's happening in Brazil and what happens everywhere else, as in Germany and in the United States. There are lots of connections to the United States, and this should be discussed, I think.
Yeah, if I can just say one thing, I think that, Miriam, for example, Lula got 82% of popularity. Dilma got 84% of popularity. I ask myself, well, if you have not the conditions to make this type of change, when you have 84% of popularity, I ask when this will happen, and which are these types of conditions. I think that we are just saying in Brazil a structural limit of a type of a leftist perspective that concerns all these arrangements very proper to a leftist populism. And it's not just a Brazilian problem, it's a problem of this model that we use for 13 years. And the second point is about, let's say, the conservative perspective of the poor. I would just insist that, well, a leftist government wasn't able to, let's say, make ideological debate with these classes. Well, we opened the space for evangelical church to organize the mentality of and the discourse that circulate in this space. And this was something made by the left. Then I just hope that all these this catastrophes that we have seen would be able to put us in the process of self-criticism also, if you want a second moment of a Brazilian left.
Thank you very much, Vladimir. I think that's a good note on which to end. So I'd like to thank all of our panelists, Miriam, John, and of course, Vladimir. I'd like to thank the guests tonight, the attendees, the audience. Thank you for coming, and thank you for your excellent questions. Those are really terrific. And of course, last but not least, I'd like to thank Huyen Pham for all of the work that she does, and Devin Gillen for being our virtual and real-life videographer. So thanks again, and hope you will attend some of our future events. Just take a look at our social media, our website. And as I said, if you're interested in the discussion, you can go to the Crisis website yourself. You can contact me, and I'd be happy to give you the interview. There's so much overlap between that and the themes in the film, and of course, this discussion. Always a pleasure to see you. Thank you very much. Vladimir, get some rest now. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much. Thank you, John.
Okay.
Thank you, Samir.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you very much also for the invitation and for the debate.
Pleasure. Bye.
Ciao.
Bye.
Bye.